The discovery at the local farmer's market. It was an ordinary Saturday morning at the bustling Crescentville Farmers Market in small-town Missouri. The air buzzed with chatter and laughter as families strolled from one colorful stall to another, their baskets laden with farm-fresh vegetables, jars of homemade jam, and sizzling barbecue ribs. Amidst the lively backdrop, Mrs. Dorothy Perkins, a retired schoolteacher, arrived early as usual to beat the weekend crowd. Her favorite stop? Miller's Butcher Stall, known for its premium cuts at unbeatable prices. "Morning, Charlie," Dorothy greeted the round, jovial butcher behind the counter. Charlie Miller tipped his hat, flashing his familiar carefree grin. He'd been running his stall here for over a decade, earning a steady stream of loyal customers drawn to his perfect marbled steaks and sharp sense of humor. "What can I get you today, Dorothy? Ribeyes? Lamb chop specials? Or I've got some really nice soup bones going cheap, perfect for that stew of yours," he suggested. "Soup bones it is," Dorothy replied, peering down at a bin brimming with fresh cuts of animal bones. Charlie dug deep into the pile and tossed a few pieces into a paper bag, weighing them with care. Back home, Dorothy unpacked her Sunday groceries, humming a favorite Johnny Cash tune. When she reached for the bag from Miller's Butcher Stall, a peculiar shape caught her eye. One bone was different. Oddly shaped, long and uneven, it didn't resemble the usual animal bones she was used to tossing into her stew pot. "Now hold on a minute," she muttered to herself, holding the bone closer. The texture was unnervingly rough in some areas, smoother in others. Dorothy had spent her high school years helping her father, a cattle rancher, process livestock, so she knew her way around animal anatomy. And this? This didn't look like any cow or pig bone she'd ever seen. "It almost looks— no, that's ridiculous." She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought forming in her mind. The notion refused to leave. Under the warmth of her kitchen light, the bone's true nature became harder to deny. The proportions were startlingly human-like. Two wire-thin ends protruded from a thicker midsection, eerily resembling a femur. But how could that be? Dorothy felt a chill crawl up her back. This can't be real," she breathed to herself, half laughing at her own paranoia. Still, her hands trembled as she fetched her glasses and stared again. The unease grew heavier, until she couldn't ignore it anymore. Heart racing, she grabbed the phone and dialed the local sheriff's office. "Sheriff's Department, Rural County Office." "Rural County Sheriff's Office, Deputy Hunt speaking," came the laid-back voice on the other end. "Deputy Hunt, this is Dorothy Perkins. Listen, I know how this is gonna sound, so bear with me," Dorothy began nervously. She cradled the phone tightly between her ear and shoulder. "I'm looking at a bone. I'm not sure if it's, from a person, but it doesn't look like it belongs to any animal I'm familiar with." The line went silent for a moment. "A bone, you say? You mean like what, someone found it hiking or something?" Hunt replied. No, I bought it from Charlie Miller's stall down at the farmer's market this morning. It's supposed to be for stew, but this one's got me real uneasy. Can you come and look at it?" Her voice came out tighter than she intended. There was another pause. Finally, Hunt sighed. Clearly he thought this was a prank or a result of overactive senior nerves. But protocol was protocol. "All right, ma'am, stay put. I'll swing by." When Deputy Hunt pulled up outside Dorothy's neat single-story house 20 minutes later, the morning was still bright and cheerful. A stark contrast to the cloud of suspicion hanging in Dorothy's kitchen. Once inside, she handed him the bone, apologizing profusely for the fuss. "Better safe than sorry, huh?" he said with a half-chuckle, flipping the bone in his hand. Dorothy noticed his smile faltered slightly as he examined it closer. He didn't try to joke again. "I'm gonna need to take this back to the lab," Hunt finally said, stuffing the bone into an evidence bag. His casual demeanor had disappeared. "You did the right thing calling us, Mrs. Perkins." Within an hour, rumors began flying around Crescentville faster than the local factory's steam whistle at quitting time. Charlie Miller's butcher stall was cordoned off by police tape, and deputies were seen loading several large bins of bones from his inventory into the back of their vans. The sight was enough to stop even the busiest shoppers in their tracks, fear spreading like wildfire. "What's going on? Is Charlie selling bad meat?" whispered one concerned shopper. "Worse," said another, lowering his voice. "Someone said it might not even be just animal meat." In a single morning, the cheery farmer's market, the heart of this sleepy Midwest town, transformed into a crime scene. Little did the townsfolk know, this was only the beginning of a revelation far darker than anyone could have imagined. The horrifying confirmation: human bones. At the rural county sheriff's lab, the fluorescent lights buzzed softly as crime scene technicians carefully examined the bone brought in by Deputy Hunt. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee, a mix that always seemed to hang in the air. John Rollins, the county's lead forensic analyst, was leaned over a steel table, his glasses pushed high on the bridge of his nose as he carefully inspected the bone. His assistant, a young woman fresh out of school named Emily Carter, typed notes into a laptop nearby, glancing nervously at Rollins' reaction every few minutes. The inconspicuous paper bag labeled Fargo Market Incident sat to the side, now empty. "This doesn't feel right, John," Emily muttered, breaking the silence. "I mean, what are we really saying here? A human bone mixed in with beef bones?" She shuddered as the words left her lips. Though new to the job, she wasn't naive enough to shrug this off as a simple mistake. Rollins exhaled slowly through his nose, his expression grim. "You're not wrong," he murmured almost to himself. "It's not every day you see something like this." Back at the sheriff's office, Deputy Hunt marched into the office where Sheriff Marvin Tate sat, sipping black coffee from a chipped Best Grandpa mug, a relic left behind by his granddaughter on one of her summer visits. Tate was a man of order, short-tempered at times but always steady. He raised an eyebrow as Hunt closed the door a little harder than necessary. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Tim," Tate quipped with a smirk, but his humor faded quickly as he saw the unease on his deputy's face. "It's worse than that, Sheriff," Hunt replied, rubbing the back of his neck. "That bone Mrs. Perkins brought in? Rollins says there's a chance it might, be human." Tate set down his mug carefully, the warm, playful expression now hardened into something far more serious. "What do you mean, a chance? You saying someone could be tossing human remains in with the meat now?" "I'm not saying anything yet, sir," Hunt replied, holding up his hands. "But Rollins is running the tests, says it'll take a day or two to get a match. It's just—" He trailed off, frowning. "Something about all this feels off." Tate nodded, his jaw tightening. "All right then. For now we're keeping this quiet. If it gets out that Charlie Miller might have been slinging human bones down at the market—" He didn't finish the sentence, shaking his head. "This town'll lose its damn mind." The lab results are in. By late afternoon the next day, Rollins stood stoically in the sheriff's office. The air in the room felt 10 degrees colder as Sheriff Tate, Deputy Hunt, and a few of the senior officers clustered together near the desk. "Well?" Tate asked, eyes locked on Rollins. "The tests came back faster than I expected," Rollins began, rubbing the bridge of his nose. It wasn't excitement that brought him in a rush, it was dread. "Sheriff, that bone, it's human." The room went still. "Jesus Christ," one officer muttered under his breath, running a hand through his hair. "You're sure?" "Positive," Rollins said flatly. "Mid to late 30-year-old male based on the analysis. The cuts on the bone are deliberate." He hesitated before continuing. "Whoever handled this had some level of skill. We're talking about clean instrument marks, like the kind you'd see from professional butchering equipment." Tate stood up slowly, resting his hands on the desk in front of him so firmly the wood creaked under the pressure. "So, you're telling me somebody butchered a person and sold their damn remains at the grocery stall?" Rollins didn't flinch. "That's what it looks like." A stunned silence fell over the room. Then, as if on cue, everyone started talking at once. "Who would do something like this?" "We have to shut down the market. Charlie Miller's gotta be involved." "Everybody shut up!" Tate bellowed, slamming a hand on his desk. The chatter died instantly. "Rollins, do we have anything connecting this to Miller?" Rollins shook his head. "Not yet. All we've got is this bone and the fact it was in a bag from his stall, but it's not enough to charge him with anything. Yet." Tate looked over at Deputy Hunt. "I want Miller brought in for questioning. Now, quiet. Don't let the press get wind of this, got it?" Hunt nodded, already grabbing his hat on the way out. Confronting Charlie Miller, Deputy Hunt found Charlie Miller in his usual spot that afternoon, loafing around the back of his battered food truck, now parked behind the market as police tape fluttered in the breeze. Charlie's bright demeanor was noticeably diminished, and his pale face glistened with sweat under the spring sun. "Afternoon, Charlie," Hunt called, his voice neutral. "Mind coming down to the station to answer a few questions?" Charlie blinked, looking like a deer caught in headlights. "Questions? What for?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "We've got some concerns about inventory from your stall," Hunt answered carefully. "It ain't an arrest or anything, but Sheriff Tate would appreciate your cooperation." Charlie wiped his hands down the front of his apron, nodding quickly. Yeah, sure. Whatever y'all need, I'll come in. His voice wavered, and something in his tone sent warning signals shooting up Hunt's spine. This man wasn't just nervous, he was scared. The tipping point back at the station, as Charlie sat under flickering overhead lights, it didn't take long for his mask of composure to crack. With Tate staring him down and Hunt carefully prodding him for answers, Charlie finally threw up his hands. All right, I don't know how it ended up there, he blurted, his voice wobbling. I swear, I don't, I buy some bones cheap from this guy who runs a slaughterhouse outside of town. He's the one who handles that stuff. I don't ask questions, so maybe it came from his end. And this guy? Tate pressed, his voice even yet ice cold. What's his name? Charlie hesitated for a long moment, his eyes darting nervously to the two officers. Finally he muttered, Greg Hansen. He runs Hansen Processing out by Route 43. Tate looked at Hunt, nodding grimly. Well, Hunt, I think it's about time we paid Greg Hansen a visit. The mysterious disappearances. The small town of Crescentville hadn't known much excitement outside of the annual Harvest Festival, the occasional high school football rivalry, and the rare gossip that made its way around the diner on Main Street. But as news of the discovery at Miller's butcher stall spread, so did whispers of something darker. A much more sinister realization began taking shape as people pieced together a troubling pattern. At the sheriff's office, Sheriff Tate rubbed the bridge of his nose as Deputy Hunt shuffled a growing pile of missing persons reports across his already cluttered desk. All right, let's go through it one more time, Tate muttered, the weariness creeping into his voice. Who have we got? Lay it out! Hunt adjusted his hat, flipping through his notes. So far we've got 4 missing folks from within the past few weeks. First up, there's Javier Martinez, 28, known around here as a ranch hand and part-time delivery driver. He was the one who used to bring cattle out to Hansen Processing, the slaughterhouse Charlie Miller mentioned. Tate leaned back in his chair, resting his boots on the edge of the desk. When was he last seen? April 12th, Hunt replied. His brother said Javier left home early that morning with a truckload of cattle. Didn't show up for dinner that night, which was unusual for him. Truck hasn't been found either. Tate exhaled sharply. All right, next, Hunt pointed to another file. Lizzie Holden, 41. She worked at Hansen Processing as a bookkeeper, handling the money, keeping track of shipments, that sort of thing. She's been missing since April 19th. Her husband thought she was working extra late, but when he went by the office, it was locked up tight. No sign of her car, just gone. She worked there, huh? Tate's lips pressed into a thin line. He leaned forward, gaze narrowing. That makes 2 people connected to the slaughterhouse. Keep going. Then there's Rick Meyer, Hunt continued, lowering his voice slightly, as if the name alone carried weight. 53, independent hauler. Did odd jobs hauling meat crates from Hansen Processing to different markets. Guy drank too much on occasion, but always showed up for work. Last seen April 22nd. He was supposed to make a delivery to one of the bigger supermarkets in the county, but never made it. And they didn't report that immediately? Tate scowled. Apparently the supermarket manager thought Rick was just too drunk to make the run and called another truck instead. Took 2 days for anyone to notice he'd gone completely off the radar. Tate shook his head in frustration, tapping a pencil against the edge of his desk as Hunt flipped to the 4th case. And this one, Sheriff, is the oddest of all. Sandy Briggs, 29, single mom. She wasn't connected to Hansen Processing, or at least not officially. Worked as a waitress at Marnie's Diner but lived out near Hansen's property. That's the same girl that rents that old trailer just off Route 43, right? Tate asked, his brow furrowed. Yeah, that's her, Hunt replied. Neighbors say she went for groceries around 7 p.m. last Thursday. Her 2 boys got picked up by her sister earlier that day. No one's heard from her since. Hunt paused, his voice quieter this time. Her car, found abandoned about 3 miles south of the market. Keys were still in the ignition. Tate tossed the pencil down and leaned back, his face grave. What the hell is going on here, Tim? 4 missing persons, all within 2 weeks and all close to or directly connected to Hansen Processing. Hunt nodded solemnly. Feels like something bigger than just bad luck, Sheriff. The town reacts. By midweek, the Crescentville grapevine had exploded. At the nail salon, in the pews of the Baptist church, over checkers games on front porches, rumors spread with wildfire urgency. You heard about Sandy Briggs? Poor thing just vanished into thin air. Bet her no-good ex had something to do with it. No, it's those drifters from the highway. They wander down here, no one notices until BAM! People go missing. 4 people. And they all seem tied up with that slaughterhouse. You think there's something weird going on up there? Theories ranged from plausible to outright absurd. It wasn't long before the market, the diner, and even the local church saw a drop in attendance. Fear had settled over Crescentville, and the friendly atmosphere the town was known for had been replaced with trepidation. Parents kept children close. Strangers were treated with suspicion. Mary Perkins, the woman who first discovered the bone, walked into Sheriff Tate's office during the commotion one afternoon. She clutched her purse tight, her knuckles white against the leather straps. "Sheriff," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I've lived in this town all my life. I've never seen anything like this. 4 people? 4?" She paused, leaning in closer. "You don't think it could be someone local, do you?" Tate looked up at her, his mouth a thin, humorless line. "Mary, we're following every lead we can, that's all I can say." "But surely," Mary hesitated, then finally whispered, "surely Charlie Miller isn't involved in this?" Tate's sharp gaze told her she had hit a nerve he didn't want touched. "We haven't charged Mr. Miller with anything," he said firmly. "He's cooperating with the investigation." Mary nodded, but the doubt still lingered like a shadow in the space between them. Questions without answers. In the days that followed, Sheriff Tate couldn't shake the growing suspicion that these disappearances weren't separate coincidences. Each missing person either worked at, delivered to, or lived near Hansen Processing. Not to mention the human bone that had surfaced from Miller's stall. It was no longer a question of if the cases were connected, but how deeply. "All right, Tim," Tate said as he stared down at the map pinned to his office wall that marked the home addresses and locations tied to the missing individuals. Red pins formed a haunting cluster around Hansen Processing. "We've got ourselves a pattern. Circle the wagons, let's pay Mr. Hansen a visit." The clues at the slaughterhouse. The Hansen Processing slaughterhouse was a half-mile off Route 43, hidden behind a row of overgrown trees and a rusted barbed wire fence. From the exterior it looked like any other run-down rural meat plant, tall metal silos, a row of dingy trucks, and a gravel lot littered with discarded pallets. But as Sheriff Tate, Deputy Hunt, and a small team of officers approached, the place took on a much more sinister aura. The faint stench of decay hung in the air, stronger than what you'd expect even from a slaughterhouse. "God almighty," Hunt muttered, covering his nose as they stepped out of their squad cars. "You smell that, Sheriff?" "Smells wrong," Tate nodded stiffly. "This ain't normal, not for a plant this size." They moved toward the main entrance, their boots crunching against the gravel. The building's gray walls were streaked with rust, and one of the "no trespassing" signs was hanging by a single bolt, twisting lazily in the breeze. Sheriff Tate banged his fist on the metal door. "Greg Hansen, Sheriff's Department, open up!" There was no response at first, just the strange silence of the desolate property. Then, after a long moment, the door creaked open just enough for a wiry man in coveralls to poke his head out. His thin face was unshaven, and his gaze darted nervously between the group of officers. Can I help you fellas?" the man stammered. "Greg Hansen?" Tate asked, his tone hard. "Yeah, that's me," the man replied, his voice uneven. "What's this about?" "We got a warrant to search your premises," Tate said, holding up the paperwork. "Step aside." Greg hesitated, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. "Hold on now," he said, raising his hands. "Warrant? For what? I ain't done nothing." "Then you don't have anything to worry about," Deputy Hunt muttered, brushing past him. "Now step aside." The search begins. The officers fanned out through the slaughterhouse, their flashlights casting eerie beams of light over blood-stained floors and walls. The smell only grew stronger as they ventured deeper into the facility, making even some of the seasoned officers gag. The first real clue came near the cutting area, a back room with rows of stainless steel tables and large industrial saws. "Sheriff!" one of the officers called out. He was kneeling by a dark stain on the concrete floor next to a pile of trash bags. This ain't just cow blood." Tate approached, crouching to inspect the stain. It was thick, dark, and unmistakably human. He glanced at the pile of bags nearby, noting the way one of them bulged awkwardly, as if something solid was stuffed inside. "Get that open," he ordered. The officer hesitated, then carefully pulled the top of the bag apart. Inside, tangled among other debris, was a clump of dirty, matted hair. The room went silent. Hunt stepped closer, shaking his head. Jesus Christ. A disturbing find-out in the slaughterhouse yard, near the wastewater treatment area, another team made a grim discovery. Sheriff Tate joined them as they stood around a deep pit covered by a steel grate. The smell emanating from it was overpowering, so bad it made Tate step back and cough. "What's in there?" he asked, pulling a bandana over his face. "We're not sure yet," one of the officers replied. But there's something. He shined his flashlight down into the murky depths of the pit. Deputy Hunt knelt beside the grate, squinting into the darkness. Sheriff, that looks like bones. Tate's jaw tightened. Animal? Maybe, maybe not. Hunt motioned at the silty liquid at the bottom of the pit. Send in the retrieval gear. Whatever's sitting down there, we're pulling it out. Nearby, another officer waved Tate over. Sheriff, you're gonna want to see this. Behind the slaughterhouse, hidden amongst overgrown weeds, was an old storage shed. Half hidden beneath a torn tarp inside the shed were several large plastic containers. When the officers pried one open, the contents were enough to make their stomachs churn. Chunks of meat, mixed with what looked disturbingly like human tissue. My God, Hunt mumbled, backing away. Bag it all, Tate said grimly. Every piece. We're taking it back to the lab. Hanson's story collapses. Meanwhile, back in the makeshift office inside the slaughterhouse, Greg Hanson sat in a folding chair, sweat dripping down his temple as he faced down Sheriff Tate. I told you I don't know nothing about no human remains, Greg protested, his voice cracking. We process beef, that's it. Nothing illegal's going on here. Tate slammed a hand on the table, making him jump. Then explain the bloodstains. Explain the hair we found in your cutting room. Explain the goddamn bones in your wastewater pit. Greg opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His eyes darted toward the door like a trapped animal looking for an escape. Don't even think about it, Tate warned, his voice low and dangerous. You screwed up, Hanson. Big time. Now who else is involved? Talk. Look, Greg stammered, wringing his hands. I just run the damn place. I swear, I don't ask questions about where the shipments come from. I got bills to pay, all right? That's all this is. And where do they come from? Hunt pressed, leaning in close. The shipments. Who supplies your inventory? Greg hesitated, then muttered under his breath. Carter. Joe Carter. He was supposed to handle disposal, too. Tate shared a grim look with Deputy Hunt. Joe Carter, huh? Well, looks like our next stop's wherever Carter's hiding. The aftermath of the search. By the time the search concluded, the slaughterhouse was a certified crime scene. Everything from the cutting tables to the wastewater treatment tanks was flagged for evidence collection. A convoy of squad cars and forensic vans lit up the dark rural road as they hauled away bags of evidence and the grim contents of the plastic containers. Word spread quickly through Crescentville. People whispered about the horrifying discoveries, blood, hair, bones, found at Hanson Processing. The small town's unease turned into outright fear. And as Sheriff Tate stood outside the slaughterhouse, staring at its darkened windows, he knew in his gut that this was just the tip of the iceberg. This ain't over, he muttered to himself, lighting a cigarette with shaky hands. Not even close. A lead from a witness. The following morning, Sheriff Tate sat back in his chair nursing a cup of strong coffee, his tired eyes poring over the growing mountain of case files stacked on his cluttered desk. The grim discoveries at Hanson Processing had taken over every waking moment of his attention, but answers still felt painfully out of reach. Theories ping-ponged in his mind, disorganized, incomplete, frustrating. The phone on his desk buzzed, breaking his train of thought. He picked it up absently. Tate here. Sheriff, we got someone down at the front desk, came the voice of Deputy Hunt on the other end. Says they've got something to tell us. Something about Hanson. Tate straightened, setting his coffee aside. Who is it? Name's Harriet Benton. She lives out near Route 43, couple miles from the slaughterhouse. Says she's been seeing strange stuff going on late at night. Tate frowned. Harriet Benton was one of those small-town staples everyone knew. A widow in her 60s who'd lived in Crescentville her whole life. She didn't usually go looking for trouble, but she also didn't make things up. If Harriet said something was off, it was worth listening to. Send her back, he said, grabbing a notepad. A nervous story. A moment later, Harriet shuffled into Tate's office, clutching her purse tightly against her side. She was dressed in a faded cardigan despite the warm weather, her lined face a mix of tension and uncertainty. She perched on the edge of the chair Tate gestured to, not quite comfortable but clearly resolute. Hunt followed her in, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. Mrs. Benton, Tate began, his voice steady, Hunt says you've got something to tell us. Take your time. Harriet glanced toward the window, then back at Tate. Sheriff, I don't want to stir up trouble, but I just can't sit on this. It's been weighing on me, and after what I've heard y'all found at Hanson's, well, I feel like I'd be doing wrong if I didn't come forward. Tate nodded, jotting something down on his pad. You're not stirring up anything, ma'am. We're grateful you came in. What have you seen? She cleared her throat. Well, like I told your deputy up front, I live out by Route 43, about a mile north of Hanson's place. Hasn't ever been much of an issue. Place was quiet, you know. But about 2 weeks ago I started noticing things. Things like what? Hunt asked, his expression unreadable. Harriet licked her lips. It's the lights, Sheriff. And the noises. It's not normal, not for a place like that. Go on. Well, she began, clutching her purse a little tighter, a few nights a week, always late. Round midnight, sometimes later, I see these bright lights coming from the yard at Hanson's. Big floodlights, like they're working out there. But they're only on for a couple of hours, not all night or anything. Big lights, Tate repeated. And you're sure they're coming from the slaughterhouse? Clear as day, she said. My kitchen window faces south, looks straight toward their property. When those lights are on, it's like a beacon cutting through the dark. And the noises? Tate pressed. Harriet paled slightly, her voice dropping. That's the part that's got me worried, Sheriff. There's times when those lights are on, I swear I hear screaming. Tate's pen froze mid-sentence. Screaming? Not loud, like, something violent's happening right outside my door, she explained quickly. It's muffled, faint, but it doesn't sound like cattle or pigs either. It sounds like people. Tough questions. Hunt leaned forward slightly, his jaw tightening. Mrs. Benton, I don't mean to doubt you, but are you sure it's screaming? Middle of the night, all quiet out there. It could have been wind animals, even your TV, maybe? Harriet turned to Hunt, a flash of irritation crossing her face. Deputy, I've lived in that house for over 40 years. I'd know the sound of the wind or the coyotes. This was different. Felt wrong. It ever happened during the day? Tate asked, scribbling something down. No, Harriet shook her head. That's what makes it so strange, just the lights and the sounds late at night. And one other thing. You didn't ask, but a couple nights ago I saw someone out there. Tate looked up sharply. Someone working? I don't think so, she said, frowning. It wasn't the usual truck drivers, at least, not that I could tell. The man I saw was wearing regular clothes, jeans, flannel. He was standing near a dumpster by the edge of the lot. And? Harriet hesitated. He had a shovel. The room went dead silent for a moment, a chilling suspicion. Tate glanced at Hunt, who was now staring at Harriet intently. You're saying you saw a man working with a shovel outside Hanson's at night near the dumpsters? Hunt clarified, his voice slower now. What, Mrs. Benton? You think he was burying something? All I know is... Her voice cracked, and she looked down at her hands. I didn't stick around to find out, but whatever it was, I don't think he wanted anyone to see him. You catch a look at his face? Tate asked. No, sir, it was too dark for that. Tate leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under the strain. He held Harriet's gaze firmly. Mrs. Benton, I want you to listen to me real carefully now. What you've told us today is important, and I mean important. But I need you to promise me something. Don't tell anyone else about this. Not your neighbor, not your mailman, and especially not the press if they come knocking. You understand? Harriet nodded slowly. I understand. Action items. When Harriet left, the door clicked shut behind her, leaving the room thick with the weight of her testimony. Tate exhaled deeply, glaring at the stack of files on his desk. You think she's exaggerating? Hunt asked quietly. Not a chance, Tate said, shaking his head. Not Harriet. She's got no reason to lie, and everything she's saying fits with what we've already found. He tapped his pen against the desk impatiently. Lights in the middle of the night, screams. And now a man digging by the dumpster? Tell me, Tim, what do you think's in that ground out there? Hunt's mouth set into a grim line. Sheriff, I think we've got more bodies waiting to be found. Tate nodded grimly. Then it's time we wake the lab boys up. I want search teams out at Hanson's property with shovels and ground-penetrating radar by tonight. If there's something out there, we're damn well gonna find it. The accomplice in the shadows tension ran high as the investigation continued to unravel the dark secrets of Hanson Processing. The bone-chilling discovery of human remains wasn't enough to solve the case. It only opened more questions. And if Greg Hanson's trembling confession about his mysterious partner was any indication, the true architect of this horror show wasn't Greg, but someone hiding in the shadows, someone who called the shots and kept their hands clean. Late night in the station. It was late, probably closer to midnight, when Sheriff Tate sat slouched back in his chair. A cigarette burned idly between his fingers, the smoke curling lazily into the air. The small desk lamp was the only light in the office, casting long shadows across the stacks of reports and crime scene photos on his desk. Deputy Hunt knocked softly at the open door, holding a cup of what looked like the last remaining drip of coffee in the station. "You're gonna wear yourself out, Sheriff," Hunt said, placing the cup down on the desk. Tate didn't even glance up. "Spare me the lecture, Tim. If there's one more goddamn bone turning up without a name to pin it on, I'm gonna lose it." "Maybe we don't need another bone," Hunt said, lowering himself into the chair opposite the desk. "I've been looking into Hansen's so-called partner. That Carter guy. You hear of him before tonight?" "Joe Carter," Tate muttered, looking out the window into the darkness beyond. "Name doesn't ring a bell. Hansen sure squealed on him quick, though. You think he's our guy?" Hunt frowned, scratching at the stubble on his chin. "I don't know, maybe. Did some digging on Carter. He used to work at Hansen's back when it first opened." Tate's attention snapped back. "He worked there?" "Yup, looks like he was a plant manager or something. Got fired a few years back. Word is it wasn't the kind of firing where they give you a cake and a handshake neither." "What kind then?" Hunt pursed his lips. "One of Hansen's employees said Carter had a temper. Rumored he got into it with one of the younger guys on the floor. Fight got nasty. Carter busted the poor kid's lip wide open. Hansen had to cut him loose to save face." Tate shook his head, muttering, "Why is every scumbag in this county tied to that damn slaughterhouse?" "That's not even the worst of it," Hunt said, leaning forward. "Remember that dumpster Harriet Benton saw somebody digging near? Guess who had the waste disposal contract for Hansen's?" Tate groaned, rubbing his temples. "You're telling me Hansen gave Carter the contract for getting rid of their trash?" "Exactly. Greg Hansen says Carter took over all the messy stuff. Disposal, transportation of special shipments, even buying excess bones off them dirt cheap to turn into animal feed or whatever." Tate set his cigarette down in the ashtray. "So, we got a violent ex-employee with a grudge who's already got a history of taking Hansen's shitty leftovers and disposing of them. This smells rotten, Tim. Where is Carter now?" Tracking him down. The answer didn't come easy. Joe Carter had all but vanished after his last shipment from Hansen's came through. Phone disconnected. No fixed address. The only trace left behind was a dingy motel receipt from Colorado Springs, dated a week ago. Sheriff Tate, Hunt, and a veteran officer named Owens headed out the next morning, making the 3-hour drive to Colorado. As they pulled up to the rusting neon sign of Sleep Easy Motel, the place looked run down enough to make even Tate anxious. A cracked parking lot covered in oil stains and a lone vending machine with most of its buttons missing completed the scene. "This Carter guy sure picked himself a nice spot for hiding," Hunt muttered, adjusting his belt. Inside the motel lobby was no better. A lethargic desk clerk with greasy hair barely looked up from his scratched phone case as the officers entered. "Help you folks?" the clerk asked, clearly disinterested. Tate approached the desk, badge in hand. "We're looking for a Joe Carter. You got a guest by that name?" The clerk shrugged. "Don't think so." "What about a guy checked into room 12? Hunt asked, glancing at the register. "Didn't pay cash. Used a card." That seemed to punch a hole in the clerk's apathy. He squinted, chewing the inside of his cheek. "Oh, yeah. Guy in 12 checked in last week. He don't come out much, though. Quiet type." Tate exchanged a look with Hunt. "You got a key to 12? Yeah, I guess. Get it, now!" Confronting Joe Carter. The hallway to room 12 smelled faintly of mildew and stale cigarettes. Hunt carried the crowbar, just in case Carter decided to make things difficult. Owen stood by the stairwell, ready to cover the exit. Tate knocked sharply. "Mr. Carter, this is Sheriff Marvin Tate. Open the door, we'd like to ask you some questions." No reply. He tried again, louder this time, his grip tightening on the hilt of his holstered gun. "Carter, we're giving you one last chance!" Still silence. Hunt gave him a nod, and Tate stepped back, motioning for him to use the crowbar. One powerful shove was all it took for the flimsy lock to give way, the door swinging open to reveal a dingy single-bed motel room. Wrappers and crumbs covered the desk, and the faint smell of unwashed laundry filled the air. But Joe Carter wasn't hiding. He was sitting at the edge of the bed, shirt stained, hair disheveled, and face pale as a sheet. His trembling hands were raised instinctively in mock surrender. "Don't shoot," he blurted. "I didn't kill no one, all right?" "Relax, Carter," Tate growled, carefully approaching. "We're not shooting anyone. Yet." Hunt stepped in, shutting the door behind him. "All right, Joe. Time to start talking. Why don't you tell us about Hansen Processing?" The accomplice speaks. At first, Carter hesitated, his bloodshot eyes darting between the two officers. "Hansen's in deep shit already, ain't he? You don't need me for anything." "Oh, we need you," Tate said coldly, crossing his arms. "Last I checked, being the trash man for a slaughterhouse tied to human remains ain't exactly clean business." Carter rubbed his forehead, sweat dripping down his temple. "I didn't know, okay? I didn't know at first. Hanson paid me under the table to get rid of their misfits. That's all it was. I thought it was just regular meat scraps. Not this. When did you find out? Hunt pressed, his voice low. Carter hesitated. Couple months in. Dumped a load out behind Hanson's property one night and there was stuff mixed in that shouldn't have been there. Teeth, hair, pieces. And you kept doing it? Tate snapped. You mean to tell me you saw that and just kept on collecting checks? Look, you don't get it, Carter barked, trembling now. Hanson, he's not just some butcher, he's got connections. People who don't give a damn about cops, threats, nothing. I even thought about quitting. I'd end up just like them folks. Buried. Gone. You think I had a choice? Tate's jaw tightened. Well, Joe, you've got one now. Either you tell us who else is involved or you'll be neck deep in this yourself. Who are these people Hanson's so afraid of? Carter stared at them for a long moment, his expression dark. Finally, he muttered, There's a man. Downtown St. Louis. Name's Turner. Carl Turner. You find him, Sheriff, and you'll find the guy pulling all the strings. Ghoulish testimonies. Joe Carter leaned forward in his chair, his wrists cuffed to the steel table. The harsh fluorescent lights in the interrogation room cast deep shadows across his face, making his haggard features even more pronounced. Sweat pooled at his temples despite the room feeling ice cold, and his eyes darted nervously between Sheriff Tate and Deputy Hunt, who stood on either side of him like statues. You've got to believe me, Carter said, his voice thin and cracking. I didn't know how bad it was, not at first. Sheriff Tate crossed his arms and leaned back against the wall. To anyone else, he looked calm, stoic even. But Hunt, who had worked alongside him for years, could tell by the way Tate toyed with the toothpick between his teeth that the sheriff was bracing to either explode or break something. All right, Joe, Tate said quietly, leaning forward just enough for his shadow to loom over the table. Let me make this clear. You're neck deep in this already. We've found bones, blood, hair, human remains at Hanson's plant, which you've been hauling away for months, if not longer. Now tell me, his voice hardened, dropping an octave. Was that just business for you? Or are you sick in the head too? Joe flinched at the words, the chair legs creaking as he shifted uncomfortably. Look, he stammered, I didn't want to get involved, all right? Greg called me up one day, told me he had a special contract. He said he needed someone who could get rid of waste, no questions asked. Deputy Hunt frowned. Waste? You didn't think it was suspicious when he was paying you, what, $5,000 a pop to haul off bones and scraps? Carter shook his head violently, his cuffed hands rattling against the table. You don't get it. I'd been out of work for months. My truck payments were overdue. My wife, she left because we couldn't pay for rent. Greg said he'd pay cash, no paperwork, and that's all I heard. What the hell was I supposed to do? Say no? Sheriff Tate slammed a palm onto the table, making Carter flinch so hard it looked like he might shrink into his chair. Don't talk to me about what you were supposed to do. What you were supposed to do, Joe, was not haul off dead bodies. A glimpse into horror. Joe's breathing became shallow, the sound of his ragged inhales filling the room. Hunt tilted his cowboy hat back, keeping his voice measured. Let me ask you this, Joe. When did you actually figure out it wasn't just cow bones in those dumpsters? Joe hesitated, his eyes glancing toward the door for a fraction of a moment as though imagining what it would feel like to bolt out of the room. But there were 2 deputies stationed outside, and he wasn't going anywhere. Maybe, I don't know, the 3rd time I hauled a load, he muttered finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Speak up, Tate growled. Joe swallowed hard, his throat working against the lump forming there. The 3rd time I was dumping the bags at a pit on the south side of Greg's property, you know, out behind that stretch of trees. I've been dumping them blind, right? But this time the wind picked up a bag as I was throwing it out, popped it open. And? Hunt asked, his gaze narrowing. There was something inside, something I shouldn't have seen, a hand. Joe's voice cracked and he coughed to clear it. I saw a hand. The nails were still there. Fingers. Kinda sticking out, like it was reaching for something. The turning point. Sheriff Tate pushed off the wall, his boots stomping against the linoleum as he circled the table. And you're telling me you kept going back, after seeing that, Joe? Joe's eyes gleamed wetly in the harsh light, but he didn't dare break into tears. I didn't have a choice. You don't understand. I went home that night thinking I was gonna quit, that I was gonna tell Greg to find someone else. And then... His voice drifted off. And then what? Hunt pressed. Joe stared at the wall, not meeting their eyes. And then Greg called me. He said Turner wanted to see me. Tate froze mid-step. Turner? Carl Turner? The same Turner you said Greg's so damn scared of? Joe nodded quickly, the urgency now clear in his voice. Yeah, Greg always said Turner was I don't know, something big, someone you don't cross, and when I met him. Joe fell silent again, his whole body shaking now. Tate leaned in close, his voice low and deliberate. When you met him, what, Joe? You can't imagine it, Joe whispered hoarsely. The way he looked at me, like he wasn't even human, like he could see all the way to my guts. He told me to do as I was told, keep hauling the bags or else. Or else what? Tate prodded. He said he'd make me disappear, just like those people in the bags I was dumping. Horrifying details unleashed. Hunt exchanged a look with Tate, pushing his chair back slightly. How many bags, Joe? How many did you haul before this all blew up? Joe's lips quivered. I don't know. I lost count after 20 or 30 loads. At first it wasn't that often, but these past few months, it got worse, almost like they were stepping up production. Production? Tate ground the word out like gravel between his teeth. You make it sound like they were running a damn factory. Joe didn't respond for a few beats, and then under his breath he muttered, That's what it felt like. The room went cold. Tate clenched his jaw, flexing his fingers to keep from punching a hole through the cheap drywall. And what about the victims, Joe? You gotta have noticed something. Who were they? Locals? Drifters? Joe's defeated eyes finally glanced back at Tate. Turner said they don't take locals 'cause people notice when local folk go missing, but they'd go to truck stops on the interstate, offer work to folks passing through, or pick up runaways, the kind no one's gonna file a report on. Hunt cursed under his breath. Christ almighty. Breaking down, Joe was breathing hard now, each word laboring to come out. I didn't kill no one, I swear I just hauled the bags, it wasn't me. Tate's fist slammed onto the table again, loud enough to make the mirror across the room rattle. But you knew, Joe, you knew, and you still let it happen. Joe's sobs broke through, loud and raw. I didn't know how to stop him. Turner's got people in St. Louis, Chicago, maybe even outside the state. This ain't just a couple guys messing around, it's a whole operation. And you're part of it, Hunt snarled, standing to his feet. Tate raised a hand. Easy, Tim, easy. Joe's a coward, but he's talking now, and he's gonna keep talking, ain't you, Joe? Joe looked up meekly, nodding as tears slipped down his face. I'll tell you what I can, just don't let him kill me, Sheriff, please. Tate leaned in so close Joe could smell the faint smokiness of his cologne. That depends, Joe, he growled. How much more are you willing to tell us? The motive behind the crimes. Later that night, after hours of piecing through Joe Carter's confessions and Greg Hansen's panicked denials, Sheriff Tate sat down heavily at his desk. His office was quiet, save for the tick of the wall clock and the occasional creak of the old wooden floor. The deeper this investigation unfolded, the clearer it became that Carl Turner wasn't just the shadowy figure pulling strings, he was the mastermind, the architect of an operation so dark it left a hole in Tate's gut. Deputy Hunt knocked quietly, stepping into the office with a cautious look. You gonna sleep at all, Sheriff? Tate snorted, leaning back and rubbing his temples. Sleep is a luxury for people who ain't neck-deep in body bags and psycho butcher villains. Hunt sat across from him, the chair letting out a loud groan under the weight of his sturdy frame. He set down a manila folder with a soft thud. I went digging into Turner's past like you asked. Figured you'd want to hear it before you light another cigarette. Tate sighed, but waved at him to go on. Hit me with it. Unraveling Turner's history, Hunt opened the folder, revealing grainy old photos and handwritten police reports from long before either of them had joined the Crescentville force. Turner's been on the radar for a while, Hunt began, shuffling through the pages. Back in the 90s, he ran a string of cattle farms out near St. Louis. Legit work at first, or at least that's what it looked like. Started small, built it up into something regional. Livestock auctions, partner farms, the whole deal. But then he starts taking out loans. Big ones. Tate raised an eyebrow. How big? Millions, Hunt said simply. Guy was racking up debt faster than a gambler at a craps table. Problem was, the farms weren't making enough to cover it. Bad investments, bad weather, maybe just bad luck. Who knows? All I know is by 2005, every single farm was delinquent. Barely scraping by. Tate leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. So what, he just went bankrupt? Couldn't pay his bills and decided murder was the next best option? It's worse than that, Hunt replied grimly, flipping to the next report. You know how some guys, when they're desperate, they'll skim off the top, play dirty to stay afloat? Well, Turner skipped dirty and went straight to scumbag territory, started falsifying inventory records claiming he sold more cattle than he actually did, pissed off the ranchers he worked with, and pretty soon folks started whispering that he wasn't just running low on product, he was running low on ethics. And Tate urged, the knot in his stomach tightening. And, Hunt continued, his bookkeeper, woman named Clarissa Daniels, figured it out. She threatened to go to the authorities, and guess what happens? Clarissa goes missing one day on her way home, found her car 2 weeks later in the bottom of a ravine, but no sign of the body. Let me guess, Tate muttered. Turner played dumb. Not just dumb, Hunt said with a humorless chuckle, but stone-cold innocent. Cried on TV, said Clarissa was like family to him, pulled the grieving boss card and the cops didn't have enough to pin him. Walked away clean. Tate leaned back, exhaling sharply. And that was his first taste. First time getting away with something bigger than checkbook fraud. Pretty much, Hunt confirmed. Turner started rebuilding after that. Changed business models. Instead of open farms, he opened up slaughterhouses. Started specializing in processing meat for big corporations. And this is where it gets real ugly. He trailed off, tapping his finger against the next sheet of paper. Tate frowned. Go on. The profit motive. Turner realized there was a faster way to make money, Hunt started again, his tone heavier now. See, meat processing is expensive. Tight regulations, lots of waste, high overhead. But it turns out there's a black market demand for what the USDA tosses out. Animals that don't pass inspection. Secondary butchers buy 'em dirt cheap to sell overseas, where nobody gives a damn about an FDA stamp. All right, Tate said slowly, the pieces starting to form in his mind. Well, Turner figured out it wasn't just cows and pigs he could sell. Somewhere along the line, someone must have suggested it to him, or maybe he came up with it on his own, but humans? Humans are just meat, Sheriff. To someone like Turner, it's the same damn thing. The room felt colder, even though the heater rattled faintly in the corner. Tate rubbed his jaw, chewing on the thought. So, what? You're saying he started running a black market slaughterhouse? With humans? That's exactly what I'm saying, Hunt replied without missing a beat. And Hansen was his patsy, just another meat guy with no spine and a big debt to Turner. Hansen ran the dirty work while Turner stayed behind the curtain. Local drifters, runaway kids, anyone nobody'd go looking for, they were all just product. And those shipments Carter was hauling? Tate said, his voice low. Hunt nodded grimly. Parts they couldn't sell got dumped. The bones, the teeth, the things that had raised too many questions. But everything else? Processed, packaged like regular stock. Probably ended up on plates halfway across the world. Tate slammed his fist against the desk, making the ashtray jump. This son of a bitch turned people into profit margins. This ain't just greed, it's goddamn evil. A chilling revelation. The weight of Hunt's words hung in the air as Tate stood, pacing the room with slow, deliberate steps. His mind raced, trying to reconcile the enormity of what they were up against. So let me get this straight, Tate said, rubbing his temples. Turner killed to keep his operations quiet. Daniels, the bookkeeper, probably a bunch of other folks too. Then, when the money started rolling in, he figured, why stop there? Why not profit even more by turning human beings into livestock? Sheriff, Hunt said, his voice quieter now, Turner was never just a businessman. He's the kind of guy who sees people as numbers, figures on a page. If he has to bury a dozen bodies to balance his books, so be it. To him, it's just efficiency. Efficiency, Tate repeated bitterly. He's been doing this for years, hasn't he? St. Louis, Crescentville? Hell, for all we know, half the state could be tied up in this. Maybe more, Hunt admitted. This ain't some local operation. Turner's got contacts we haven't even scratched the surface of yet. Suppliers, distributors, damn near an entire criminal ecosystem, and he's right smack in the middle of it. Tate's hand clenched into a fist. Not for long. The plan to take him down. By the end of the night, the facts were clear. Carl Turner wasn't just an accomplice. He wasn't just a puppeteer pulling strings. He was the monster himself, motivated by greed, devoid of empathy. And now, it was up to Tate and Hunt to take that monster down for good. We're gonna need more than local manpower, Tim, Tate said firmly, lighting up what had to be his fifth cigarette of the night. We're bringing in state investigators, maybe even the feds. Turner thinks he's untouchable, but he's about to learn that nobody's too big to fall. Hunt gave a grim nod. Yeah, but Sheriff, be careful. Guys like Turner don't fall quietly. He won't just let us walk away with the evidence. He'll fight. Tate exhaled slowly, watching the smoke curl into the dim light. Then we'll fight harder. The trial that shocked the nation. The Crescentville courthouse had never seen anything like it. By the time Carl Turner's trial began, the story had become a national scandal, gripping people across the country. News trucks lined the streets. Journalists jostled for position by the courthouse steps, and hundreds of onlookers stood behind barricades, clutching signs ranging from "Justice for the victims" to "Lock him in the slaughterhouse." The small, sleepy town had become the center of a media frenzy. Inside the courtroom, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Each creak of the wooden benches seemed louder than the murmured conversations floating through the crowd. Sheriff Tate and Deputy Hunt entered quietly, taking seats near the back. They weren't there to make statements, that would come later, but they wanted to see the monster they had brought to justice face what was coming. The courtroom drama begins. "All rise," the bailiff called, his deep voice echoing through the chamber. The room fell silent as Judge Margaret Ellison strode in, her black robe flowing behind her. She was known for her no-nonsense approach, and her mere presence seemed to command respect. "You may be seated," she said, glancing briefly over the room before settling her sharp eyes on the defense table. There sat Carl Turner, the infamous butcher, in a crisp navy suit that somehow failed to hide the cold calculation in his demeanor. Even as the judge began outlining the charges, multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, illegal disposal of human remains, and more, Turner sat motionless, his expression one of calm indifference. Deputy Hunt leaned over to Tate. "Look at him, cool as a damn cucumber," he muttered. "The guy's got ice where his soul should be." Tate nodded, his jaw tight. "He thinks his money and lawyers will get him out of this. Let's see how smug he looks when they start pulling out the evidence." The prosecution, led by federal attorney Linda Fraser, wasted no time setting the tone. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, stepping into the center of the courtroom, her voice clear and cutting. "The man sitting before you does not see people as human beings. He sees them as commodities, resources to be exploited, discarded, and profited from. What we're about to lay before you is a trail of evidence so disturbing, so calculated, that it will leave no doubt in your minds about Carl Turner's guilt." Gripping testimonies. The trial went on for weeks. Day after day, the prosecution peeled back the layers of Turner's horrifying operation. Witness after witness took the stand. Some were experts, crime scene analysts, forensic pathologists, and financial auditors who mapped out Turner's web of deceit, but the most gut-wrenching moments came from those who had been closest to the crimes, Joe Carter and Greg Hansen. When Joe Carter was escorted into the courtroom, his hands cuffed and his face pale, the room buzzed with whispers. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in months, and his voice trembled as he answered the prosecutor's questions. "What was your role in Mr. Turner's operation, Mr. Carter?" Fraser asked. I hauled the bags," Carter replied, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I didn't know what was in 'em at first, thought it was just waste, scraps from the plant, but then—" He paused, swallowing hard. "Then I realized." "Realized what?" "That it wasn't animals, it was people." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. One juror visibly winced, while someone in the gallery whispered, "Jesus Christ." Fraser pressed on. "And did Mr. Turner ever threaten you to keep you quiet?" "Yeah," Carter said, his voice cracking. "He said if I even thought about talking to anyone, I'd end up in one of those bags myself." Sitting at the defense table, Carl Turner didn't flinch. He stared straight ahead, his hands folded neatly on the table. It was almost as though he was daring the witnesses to look at him. The prosecution's star witness. But the most explosive testimony came from Greg Hansen. After weeks of cooperating with investigators, Hansen had turned state's evidence in exchange for a reduced sentence. By the time he took the stand, he wasn't the same cocky slaughterhouse owner that Tate and Hunt had confronted months earlier. He looked defeated, almost hollow, but his testimony carried weight. "Mr. Hansen," Fraser began, holding up a stack of papers, "these are invoices signed by you, linking your company to over 30 shipments coordinated by Carl Turner. Can you confirm this?" Hansen nodded weakly. "Yes, ma'am." "And were you aware that the shipments contained human remains?" Hansen hesitated, glancing nervously at Turner, who finally showed a flicker of irritation. "Answer the question, Mr. Hansen," Fraser said firmly. "I didn't know at first," Hansen whispered. "Turner told me it was unclaimed livestock, something about rejected beef carcasses, but eventually," his voice broke. "Eventually I figured it out." "What did you figure out?" Hansen's shoulders slumped. "That those weren't cows we were processing." Turner's defense team fought tooth and nail, painting him as a legitimate businessman who had been duped by his employees. They argued that Hansen had orchestrated everything behind Turner's back, and that the prosecution lacked direct evidence tying Turner to the orders. But Fraser was relentless. "So, Mr. Turner," she said during cross-examination, Are you telling this court that as the CEO of a company tied to over 30 counts of murder, you had no idea what your own operation was doing? That's correct, Turner replied smoothly. I trusted my managers to handle day-to-day operations. It's unfortunate that trust was misplaced. Well, we've heard from your managers, Mr. Turner, Fraser said, her tone razor-sharp. And they say you knew everything. Who do you think the jury will believe? The men you left to clean up your messes, or the man who personally profited millions from their work? Turner's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. The verdict. After 6 grueling weeks, the trial reached its climax. The jury deliberated for just 2 days before returning with a verdict. As the four-person stood, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. On the count of murder in the first degree, she said, her voice steady, we find the defendant, Carl Turner, guilty. The courtroom erupted. Victims' families wept openly. Reporters scrambled to get statements, and for the first time Turner's composure cracked, just slightly, as his lawyers leaned in to whisper furiously in his ear. Tate and Hunt sat quietly in the back, watching it all unfold. There it is, Hunt said softly. Justice. Tate nodded, though his expression remained grim. Justice, yeah, but it won't bring those folks back. Turner was sentenced to death, a ruling that sparked its own wave of controversy. Joe Carter, despite his cooperation, received life in prison without the possibility of parole. Greg Hansen narrowly avoided prison by testifying, but his reputation was ruined and his business was gone. Shockwaves across America. The trial didn't just shake Crescentville, it sent shockwaves across the nation. People became hypervigilant about where their meat came from. Lawmakers passed new regulations to tighten oversight on slaughterhouses, and investigations cropped up across other states. Turner's crimes became the subject of documentaries, books, and late-night talk shows, a haunting reminder of what unchecked greed and power could do. For once, Tate said as he left the courthouse that day, the bad guy actually got what he deserved. Hunt lit a cigarette, nodding. Yeah, let's just hope there ain't more of 'em waiting in the shadows. The lingering aftermath of the case. It had been 6 months since Carl Turner's conviction, but in Crescentville, the scars from the case still ran deep. The once lively town now felt different, colder, quieter, as though an invisible weight rested on its people. At the diner on Main Street, where conversations used to be filled with laughter and harmless gossip, the air felt heavy, the talk hushed. People spoke less about the future and more about their fears. A quiet evening in the station. Sheriff Tate sat in his office late one evening, the dim light of his desk lamp casting long shadows across stacks of paperwork he still had to finish. The case may have been closed, but the fallout was everywhere. New regulations, ongoing investigations into other slaughterhouses, and lingering questions about what signs they might have missed. He leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling, the faint scent of coffee and cigarette smoke hanging in the air. Hunt knocked on the open door, a brown paper bag in one hand and 2 styrofoam cups in the other. Figured you ain't eaten yet, he said, setting the bag down on Tate's desk. Tate gave a tired grin. You know me too well. He nodded toward the seat across from him. You got one for yourself, or you just here to guilt-trip me about skipping dinner? Hunt chuckled, plopping into the chair and setting one of the cups in front of Tate. I already ate. Some of us actually respect meal breaks, you know. Tate unwrapped the sandwich, taking a bite before speaking. You been out around town much lately? He asked, his voice quieter than usual. Hunt sipped his coffee, watching Tate carefully. Yeah, stopped by the hardware store earlier. Talked to Frank Wilson, you know, the guy who runs it with his daughter. He said he hasn't been sleeping much. Keeps thinking about those poor kids they pulled out behind Hansen's plant. Tate nodded, his appetite fading faster than he'd like to admit. It's not just him. I walked into Marnie's diner this morning and could practically feel it. Like nobody wanted to talk about it, but nobody could stop thinking about it either. Hunt shrugged, his boots propped onto the edge of the desk. How could they? Hell, Tate. This wasn't just some barn fire or a bad harvest. People are always going to wonder if they walked past Turner in the grocery store, if they shook his hand at a church potluck, maybe even bought meat from that damn plant. The thought made Tate grimace. You think they'll ever stop looking over their shoulders? Hunt took another long sip of his coffee. Not anytime soon. The town's struggles. Even for those who didn't know the victims, the case left an indelible mark. Parents stopped letting their kids play outside after dark. Truck drivers passing through town found themselves met with narrowed eyes and cold shoulders, as though every stranger on Route 43 carried some hidden threat. Tourism, which had once been a small but steady lifeline for the local economy, completely dried up. At the Friday night high school football game, A few hundred fans showed up, but it wasn't the same boisterous crowd Tate remembered from years past. He stood near the bleachers, watching as kids cheered half-heartedly and parents chatted in small, uneasy groups. He caught snippets of conversation here and there, and the same name kept popping up. Turner. This town'll never be the same, not after what he did. You think they're looking into other places? Turner couldn't have done all that without help. It wasn't paranoia, it was trauma. Tate could see it in their eyes, hear it in their voices. People didn't feel safe anymore. A visit to Dorothy's. On his way home that night, Tate decided to swing by Dorothy Perkins's house. Dorothy, the retired teacher who had first found the human bone in her bag of soup bones, hadn't been to the farmer's market since that day. In fact, she rarely left her home anymore. Tate knocked gently on her door. It took a moment, but eventually Dorothy appeared, wearing her thick glasses and a cardigan that seemed too warm for the season. "Well, Sheriff," she said, forcing a smile. "This is a surprise." "Just thought I'd check in," Tate replied. "Make sure you're doing all right." Dorothy led him into the kitchen where a teapot whistled faintly on the stove. "You want some tea?" she asked, though her hands trembled slightly as she poured herself a cup. Tate shook his head. "I've been all right," she said after a moment, settling into a chair across the table. "But sometimes I can't stop thinking about it." Tate nodded slowly. "About what you found?" "That, yes," Dorothy admitted, her voice shaky. "But also about how close I came to just ignoring it. I almost didn't call you, you know? I thought, oh Dorothy, you're being silly, getting worked up over a soup bone." She looked up at Tate, her eyes glistening. "What if I hadn't called, Sheriff? How many more people would have ended up like that?" Tate leaned forward, his hands folded on the table. "Dorothy, none of this is on you. You did more than most people would have. You trusted your gut, and because of that, Turner got stopped. Don't put the weight of his crimes on your shoulders." Dorothy blinked rapidly, nodding. "I just wish I could stop thinking about their families, what they must be going through." Tate didn't have an answer for that, and the silence lingered heavily between them. The lingering wounds. Back at the station later that night, Hunt found Tate sitting alone at his desk again, staring at an old photo of Crescentville from before any of this had happened. In the photo, the town was alive, vibrant, unmarked by the shadow hanging over it now. "Still thinking about it, huh?" Hunt asked, leaning in the doorway. Tate sighed, setting the photo down. "This town's been through hell before. Bad floods, the plant fire back in '92, that tornado. But this feels different." Hunt nodded. "Because it got inside, Tate. Something evil like that, it doesn't just wreck buildings. It twists people up inside, makes them question everything." "Think they'll ever bounce back?" Tate asked quietly. "The town?" Hunt said after a moment. "Yeah, maybe. People always do. But nobody's ever gonna forget." Tate leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. "And neither will I. A community trying to heal." In the months following Turner's conviction, small efforts began to heal Crescentville's broken spirit. Community gatherings were held in the park, where families shared food and told stories about the good old days, trying to remind themselves of what life used to be. Local churches organized fundraisers for victims' families, and a quiet memorial was erected in the town square. A simple plaque with the names of the confirmed victims and the words, "We remember, we heal, we honor." But deep down, everyone knew the wounds this case left wouldn't fully heal. The trauma was too fresh, too personal. It would take years, maybe even decades, before the people of Crescentville could truly feel like they'd shaken the shadow of Carl Turner's crimes. "Time softens it," Hunt said one day as he and Tate shared a drink at the local bar. "But it never really goes away." Tate raised his glass. "To the ones we couldn't save. And to making damn sure there's never another Turner," Hunt replied. The clink of their glasses echoed in the dim light, both men lost in their own thoughts about the scars their town now carried. Lessons from the crime. The late summer air hung heavy over Crescentville as Sheriff Tate and Deputy Hunt sat on the back steps of the station, their coffee cups balanced precariously on the edge of the wooden railing. The crickets chirped in the humid night, the distant hum of cicadas reminding both men of how eerily normal life could sound, even in the aftermath of something so ugly. The case was over, Carl Turner had been convicted, and Crescentville was beginning to find its footing again. But for Tate and Hunt, the lessons left behind by the brutality of Turner's crimes were still fresh, like an open wound that hadn't yet scabbed over. A quiet reflection. "You ever think about what we missed?" Tate finally broke the silence, staring off into the dark street. His voice was low, almost questioning, as though he wasn't entirely sure if Hunt would want to answer. Hunt leaned back on his elbows, tipping his hat slightly upward so his eyes could find the stars. "Every goddamn day," he muttered. "I think about Hanson's stall down at the farmer's market. All the times I walked by it, bought a few steaks even. Hell, Tate," I joked with the guy. "And the whole time we didn't see it. People were dying right under our noses." Tate snorted bitterly, shaking his head. "I don't think it's about what we didn't see. It's about what we weren't looking for. Nobody thinks to look for human trafficking and goddamn black market murder in a sleepy Midwest town. You spend enough years here, you start to think the worst you'll find is a DUI or a backyard meth lab. Stuff like this, you just don't see it coming." "But maybe we should've," Hunt countered, sitting up and fixing his gaze on Tate. "Maybe that's the lesson here. The cost of complacency." "What are you saying, Tim?" Tate asked, his voice carrying a sharper edge now. "That we should have known Hanson was slicing up people instead of cattle? That we should have somehow known Turner was running a human slaughterhouse? Come on, man. Nobody sees something like that coming." "I'm not saying we should have known exactly what was going on," Hunt replied, his tone more controlled, deliberate. "But maybe the problem is that we just assume, right? We assume people like Hanson are decent folks because they smile, make good barbecue, and go to Sunday service. We don't ask the harder questions. Hell, when Dorothy first called you about that soup bone, didn't you think she was nuts?" Tate thought back to that day, the phone call, Dorothy's hesitant voice, the uneasy laugh he'd nearly let out because he really hadn't thought it could have been anything serious. "Yeah," he admitted after a long pause. "I thought it was just some old lady making a fuss over nothing." "There you go," Hunt said, waving a hand as though that proved his point. "We don't expect this stuff, so we don't look for it. And that's exactly how guys like Turner get away with it for so long. They hide in plain sight, Sheriff. Right out in the open, where nobody'd think to check." The words stung, but Tate didn't argue. Because deep down, he knew Hunt was right. Turner's whole operation had thrived on that very assumption, on the trust of the town, on the complacency of people too busy with their own lives to imagine the horror lurking right in their backyards. Lessons for the future. "So what do we do?" Tate asked, his tone quieter now. "You think we start questioning every guy selling steak at the farmer's market? Fingerprint everyone who owns a slaughterhouse? Spend the rest of our lives chasing shadows instead of focusing on the real problems like drugs and theft?" "Not exactly," Hunt answered, settling back into his seat again. "But think about it. If someone had asked the right questions years ago, would Turner have gotten this far? Would Hanson? It's not about being paranoid, it's about not letting ourselves get too comfortable. About digging a little deeper when something feels even a little wrong." Tate mulled this over, his hand gripping his coffee cup a little tighter. "You're saying we start treating everything like it's life or death?" Hunt shook his head. "No, I'm saying we treat people like people. We take a report seriously, even if it sounds dumb. We follow up when someone's missing, even if it's just a drifter. None of this, 'Oh, they'll show up,' or 'It's not our problem.' You know? When we don't, we let people like Turner walk all over the system." Tate sighed, leaning forward, elbows resting on his knees. "The problem is most of these folks, the ones Turner went after, they were invisible, Tim. Drifters, runaways, people no one was looking for. It's hard to listen when there's nobody around to speak for 'em." Hunt nodded grimly. "Maybe that's where we start. Making sure we're the voice for the ones who don't have one." Remembering the victims. The conversation paused as a car rolled lazily down Main Street, the headlights sweeping across the cracked pavement. When it was gone, Tate took a final sip of his now lukewarm coffee before setting the cup on the step beside him. "You think about their families much?" he asked after a long minute, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "All the time," Hunt admitted. "Sandy Briggs's boys, they're gonna grow up without a mother. Javier Martinez's brother." He shook his head. "And that's just the ones we knew about. God only knows how many others there were. Real people, Tate, real lives." "Yeah," Tate said softly. "And they deserve better than to end up as some psycho's paycheck." The weight of that truth settled between them, heavy and immovable. Neither man spoke for a while, the sounds of the summer night once again filling the silence. The bigger picture. Finally, Tate straightened, rubbing the back of his neck. "The feds are sniffing around some other states now. Places Turner had ties to. If they find any more operations like his, it's gonna be a damn circus." Hunt shook his head. "It's bigger than Turner now, Sheriff. Always was. He's just the poster boy for a problem that's been rotting underneath everything for years. You know that, right?" "I know," Tate said grimly. "Human trafficking, corruption, black market garbage like this. It doesn't just disappear because we nailed one guy. It hides, waits for the next Turner, the next Hanson. So yeah, I know, but we took one down. That's something. It is, Hunt agreed. And maybe the next time one of these bastards sets up shop, the people in charge won't shrug it off as just business. His tone softened slightly. Maybe we gave that kid in the next town over, hell in the next state over, a fighting chance. You always were the optimistic one, Tim, Tate said with a faint smirk, though his voice betrayed a glimmer of hope. A legacy of vigilance. The porch light over the station flickered briefly, and both men took it as their cue to stand. The weight of the day, and the conversation, still clung to them as they stepped back inside, but it wasn't a helpless kind of weight. It was the kind that reminded them why they got up every morning to do their job, even when it meant facing horrors like Turner's crimes. As they walked down the hall, Hunt glanced over at Tate. "You're gonna keep that plaque up in the station lobby, right? The one with the victims' names?" "Damn right," Tate said firmly. "People need to remember what happened here, not just for the victims, but for the lesson, too, that we've got to do better, all of us." "And next time someone calls about a soup bone?" Hunt asked with a slight grin. Tate chuckled dryly. "Next time we'll listen." It wasn't a perfect resolution, but in law enforcement, or life, it rarely was. Still, both men carried the same thought as they returned to their work. Sometimes the best lesson you can learn is the one you don't forget. An end, but not forgotten. Crescentville was still standing. The farm fields still stretched across the horizon, the church bells still rang on Sundays, and the corner diner still served the best pie in the county. But even in its quiet normalcy, there was something forever changed, a shadow that lingered over the town. For the residents who had lived through the ordeal, Carl Turner's conviction was an end to the nightmare. But the scars he had left behind wouldn't be so quick to fade. The ordinary that felt different. Sheriff Tate parked his squad car in front of Marnie's diner, the gravel crunching under the tires. It was late afternoon, just past the lunch rush. Through the large glass windows he could see the handful of regulars scattered at their usual tables, Jimmy Clayton reading his paper in the corner, old Mrs. Bell wiping crumbs off her spotless apron, and a couple of high school kids hunched over a shared basket of fries. From the outside, it looked like nothing had ever broken the rhythm of this small town. And yet, the silence wasn't right. Tate stepped through the door, and the tiny bell overhead jingled. Heads turned briefly, then looked back down. Conversations that once overflowed with gossip and laughter had become subdued. He tipped his hat to Marnie behind the counter, who gave him a tired half-smile. The kind of smile that said everything was fine, even when it wasn't. "Afternoon, Sheriff," Marnie greeted, serving a coffee to the man at the counter. "Sit yourself down. Coffee's on me today." Tate offered her a polite nod, slipping into the booth closest to the window. A few minutes later she brought over a steaming cup of black coffee and set it in front of him. "You're spoiling me," Tate said with a weak chuckle. Marnie shrugged, folding her arms. "After everything this town's been through, somebody's got to keep you standing, Sheriff." "Appreciate it," he replied, though his tone carried the same weight as hers. They didn't speak for a moment, the hum of the diner filling the silence. Tate glanced out the window at Main Street, quiet except for a single passing truck. "It'll come back, you know," he said softly. "The town, I mean." Marnie leaned against the booth, her expression unreadable. "Maybe. Folks are trying to move on, but how do you move on from something like that?" Tate sipped his coffee, searching for an answer he didn't have. "You don't," he admitted finally. "Not fully. You just keep going." A cemetery visit. Later that evening, as the sun melted into shades of gold and pink, Tate found himself driving to the cemetery. He hadn't planned it, but something had tugged at him the entire day, a nagging thought he couldn't shake. When he parked the car and stepped out, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots felt unnaturally loud in the stillness. The cemetery was humble, sitting on the edge of town with rows of modest headstones. When Tate reached the corner where the new plaque for the victims had been installed, he paused. The brass glinted softly in the fading light. "We remember, we heal, we honor." Below the inscription, the names of the confirmed victims had been etched. Tate took off his hat and ran a hand over his face, exhaling slowly. The silence here wasn't heavy like it was in town, it was different. It carried a kind of peace, though it was the bitter kind, the kind that didn't come easy. "Sheriff?" The voice startled him slightly. He turned to see Dorothy Perkins approaching, her hands clutching a basket of flowers. She stopped a few feet away, offering him a gentle smile. "Didn't expect to see you here." "I could say the same about you," Tate replied, stepping aside to give her space at the plaque. Dorothy knelt down slowly, arranging the flowers in front of the plaque with careful precision. "I try to come by once a week," she said quietly. "Feels like the least I can do." "You've done more for this town than anyone, Dorothy," Tate said. "You know that, don't you?" She didn't look up, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just wish I'd done it sooner. Maybe then—" Tate placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm but kind. "You can't carry that burden. None of us saw it, Dorothy. None of us even thought to look. But because of you, he's where he belongs." Dorothy nodded, though her expression didn't fully soften. Do you think they'll ever really be at peace? The families, I mean?" Tate stared at the plaque for a long moment before answering. "I don't know if anyone ever completely makes peace with something like this, but I think, as long as we don't forget, as long as we fight to make sure it doesn't happen again, that counts for something." Dorothy stood, brushing the dirt from her knees. "I hope you're right, Sheriff." Quiet conversations. Back at the station later that night, Hunt found Tate sitting at his desk, staring at the same photo of old Crescentville he'd been looking at for months. The porch light outside flickered faintly, casting moving shadows across the floor. "You're still stuck on it, huh?" Hunt asked, leaning against the doorway. Tate rubbed his temples, sighing. "Ain't something you just stop thinking about. I keep wondering what could have been different. How many lives we could have saved if we'd figured Turner out a year earlier. Or even 6 months." Hunt stepped inside, pulling up a chair. He leaned back casually, though his tone was anything but carefree. "If Turner taught me anything, it's that this job ain't about fixing everything, Tate. You're right. People died. We didn't stop him sooner. But we did stop him. And now there's one less monster walking around than there was a year ago." Tate looked up at him, his eyes tired but searching. "And that's supposed to be enough?" Hunt nodded faintly. "It ain't never enough, but it's more than if we'd done nothing." He tipped his head toward the photo on Tate's desk. "That's still our town in the picture, you know. With all its scars and bruises, it's still standing. And that's something, ain't it?" Tate let the words settle, his gaze drifting back to the photo. After everything, Crescentville was still standing, and maybe that was enough to start. Moving forward, not moving on. The coming weeks brought steps toward normalcy, though some wounds would take far longer to heal. The town park hosted its first Sunday picnic since the trial, a modest gathering of families trying to reclaim something of what had been lost. Kids ran around with sticky fingers and laughs that didn't sound forced, and at least for an afternoon the air felt lighter. At the farmer's market, a new vendor had taken over Hanson's old stall, selling nothing but vegetables and honey. The booth wasn't crowded, but it wasn't empty either. It was a start. Every morning Tate drove past the town square where the memorial stood, and every morning he slowed down, just enough to glance at the plaque. He didn't stop often. Once in a while he'd roll down his window and let the cool breeze carry the names back to him, just to remind himself. Because forgetting wasn't an option. A call to remember. One evening, back on the steps of the station, Hunt lit a cigarette and handed one to Tate. The sun was dipping low, painting the town in shades of orange and gold. "You ever think we'll stop talking about him? Turner, I mean." Tate took a drag, watching the smoke curl into the air. "Maybe. But not yet, and that's okay. Some things you're supposed to talk about. Make sure they stick." "Yeah," Hunt agreed. He flicked the ashes from his cigarette and smirked faintly. "So, what's next, Sheriff?" Tate exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest loosening just enough. "Whatever comes, Tim, whatever comes." The two men sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the town wrapping around them, the faint hum of cars, the distant bark of a dog, the easy rhythm of another evening passing by. For Crescentville, life moved forward, slowly, steadily. And though the shadow of Carl Turner's crimes might always linger, the town, and its people, were determined to keep their light burning.